Hi, my name is Gary Scudder, professor here in the core. Today I want to talk about an assignment I have used in Core 220, aesthetic expression. I think it might be something you could use also in Core 110. I've also used some of it in Core 270, Heroines and Heroes. Essentially what I want to talk about is the whole concept of what a genius is, and how do we define this and how do we recognize it. Because it's one of those terms that we use all the time, but what does it really mean? And one of the ways that I've used this to get the idea across to students is through music. Now, I don't use as much popular music as my excellent friend Bob Mayer, mainly because I don't have the expertise nor the courage, nor even Brother Lang and his fascination with Rush. But I've tended to use some classical music, and I've used a little bit of jazz. This is mainly what this is based on. What I tell my students is that one way to think about genius is this concept, that maybe a genius is a person who literally changes the world, and they essentially change the rules in the process of doing this. Now, understand when I say this, it doesn't mean that they are intentionally trying to change the world, because if they got up in the morning and said, I'm going to do something really odd to change the world, then I don't really think that's a definition of genius. Instead, I think genius is based on the concept that they cannot not change the world. Now, they may set themselves a task, but that is a more personal quest. Like they may say, I'm getting bored with myself, or I want to give myself a task that no one else has ever done before, but to me that's completely internal. And I think of Picasso and his 50-odd versions of the famous Velázquez painting of the Spanish royal family, because he wanted to see if he could do it. And I don't think he necessarily wanted to change the world as much as he wanted to change himself. So I asked the students to think about that notion that maybe what a genius does is essentially change the rules. Now, that spins off a couple different ways. One, it means that often in the process of doing that, the artist is saying to the audience, you must now do more. In the past, you did a certain amount in regards to responding to what I, the artist, did, but now I'm expecting more of you. And two, because the artist is doing something remarkably different, it may also mean that it is unappreciated, if not actually hated. And maybe that's the other definition between just a performer and an artist. Is the artist essentially, I think in the end, like any great artist or writer, is doing something deeply personal, and maybe they don't particularly care if no one likes it. That's what I'm always deeply suspicious of when you see a musician or an author say that their new work is really going to speak to their audience. And I think, well, maybe you've stopped caring now, because probably if you were truly sincere, you wouldn't care what anybody else thought about this. So it's I think that spins off of it. Now, what I do is this. I have a PowerPoint, which again, I am happy to send out. I loan this PowerPoint to all sorts of folks, so I'm the king of all PowerPoints. And what I do is I start off talking a little bit about classical music, and I start off talking about Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, his 1876 classic ballet. And I show the students about 3 or 4 minutes of the final dance. And I'm trying to give them a baseline for something to compare it to. And it's not because I'm mocking Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake, because I love Swan Lake. And in fact, in Heroines and Heroes, I make the students watch all of Swan Lake and actually write a paper on it. But I'm assuming that some students have never actually seen a ballet, so I want to give them a sense of what a classic ballet is. Then I show them part of Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, especially the sacrificial dance, and give them a sense, okay, now compare Tchaikovsky to what Stravinsky's trying to do, and why in 1913, when you actually bring Rite of Spring to the audience for the first time, you literally have essentially a riot, because people are so horrified by it. So I show them the actual sacrificial dance. Now, I will not show you this, but just you can get a little sense of the music, which is remarkably discordant as compared to Tchaikovsky. It also sounds a lot like the Psycho shower scene, come to think of it. you get the very discordant nature of it. And again, I show them literally about 5 or 6 minutes of the sacrificial dance, which ends with the ballerina essentially disrobed. So you go from the classic balance of Tchaikovsky to this remarkably discordant approach. The one thing I don't want it to be with the students is I don't want it to simply be a lecture. I want each of these to be an artifact. So every time I stop, I ask the students, okay, what have we learned from this? What can we draw from it? What's the difference between Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky? Does this mean that Stravinsky is a better artist than Tchaikovsky? Most people would say no. But he obviously has a very clear and very different vision. And in so doing, you've obviously changed the rules. And it means that the audience then is being asked to do something else, which is why they rioted in 1913. I then spend some time talking about Miles Davis. Now, everybody knows I love Miles Davis, and all right-thinking individuals know Miles Davis is the greatest American genius of the 20th century. And the reason why I say this is that Davis essentially did this time after time after time. Almost like clockwork, about every 2 years, Davis put out a new album which was fundamentally different than the one before, and every time he changed the rules and again asked the audience to do more. I play them part of 1957 album Birth of the Cool, which in addition to being Lisa Simpson's favorite album, which Homer finds by hiring a private detective, it's sort of classic hard bebop, but with a really unusual 9-piece band that no one had ever done before. This sort of classic bebop, a lot of amazing improvisation. But within 2 years, Davis was tired of it and tired of that mode of improvisation, and had moved on to the recording of sort of the quintessential jazz album, Kind of Blue. And what made this different is that you've moved away from the traditional progressive transitional view and moved on to modal jazz, which I try to explain to the students, and I do just about as bad a job as I do when I'm explaining neuroscience and Linden. But at least we get the idea of a very different way to improvise musically, and the fact that this is the most popular jazz album of all time. And I play part of Birth of the Cool, and I play part of Kind of Blue, but only a couple minutes. But then I mainly focus on Sketches of Spain, which came out literally only 1 year after the seminal album Kind of Blue. And what happens is, I would argue that Sketches of Spain is probably an even more clear work of genius. And in this case, what Davis has decided to do is, let's see if we can combine jazz and classical music. This came out in 1960. And beyond the fact that this is a very lovely elegiac piece, it's about as far removed from Kind of Blue, and especially from Birth of the Cool, as you could possibly imagine. And the very fact that Davis, in his sort of protean genius, would think, oh, we can clearly bring jazz and classical music together, speaks to the fact that once again he has completely changed the rules. And he does this repeatedly. Now, by the time we get to the end of the 1960s, suddenly you have Bitches Brew. This is just another piece which sort of messes with the minds of the students. And in this, Davis essentially creates the notion of fusion jazz, whereas before we had brought jazz and classical music together, now we're going to bring jazz and rock together. I play a big chunk of Bitches Brew for the students, mainly because it completely messes with them, and they really just do not know what to make of it. Sorry for the delay, you know, with YouTube. They always have to have the commercial in first. I shouldn't complain because they're giving it to me for free, but I do. So they only play about 7 minutes of Bitches Brew, and at that time the students normally say, when is he going to be done warming up? Because I think they view it as a live album, that eventually he will get warmed up and start playing. But of course, this is the song itself, which carries on for about 20 minutes. Both Sketches of Spain and Bitches Brew were those classic dividing line albums, wherein the true purists immediately got it, especially with Sketches of Spain, where the true classic purist jazz aficionado said, okay, this is the work of genius, even if it's doing something different. And the popular audience sort of sat there and was like, I don't know really what to make of that. Could we not go back to cool jazz, which seems to be something I can get my brain around? So here, this is why I'm such a big fan of Davis as a true genius, simply because he did this again and again and again. Now, if I have time at the end of class, and again, keep in mind, I view this less of a lecture and more of an examination of artifacts. So we stop after every piece of music and usually write on the board, okay, what did we get from this? And in addition, at the end of class, taking time to essentially, what's the biggest takeaway? Now, if I have time at the end, I do more popular music, and this is where I come in and come back to something which is closer to my heart, and that is Neil Young. As everybody knows, I'm a complete Neil Young freak, and yes, I've made a pilgrimage to his hometown because I'm that much of a geek. But what I play for the students here are selections of two different albums. One, I play a little bit of Heart of Gold from Harvest. And even though Neil has almost an unmatched career as compared to longevity, I think he's literally only had one #1 hit in his entire career, and that was Heart of Gold from Harvest. But it was also a song that Neil was almost horrified by in regards to its popularity, so much so that he didn't even play it in concert for over 10 years, because the thought of being so much in the middle of the road was something that he was just horrified by. Now, 3 years later, you have what I consider to be the greatest rock album of all time, Tonight's the Night. Which is, again, about as far as the pleasantries, about as far from the pleasantries of Harvest and Heart of Gold as you can imagine. It's this long sort of condemnation of and homage to the undercurrent of the drug world, and the entire thing is filmed at 3 o'clock in the morning, and the entire thing is magically out of tune. They miss the notes all the time, they miss the connections. But if you think about an album which just completely holds together thematically, this is it. And even Neil would say, when people say, what is your greatest album? Is it Harvest? And he would say, oh no, it's Tonight, because I think he understood that it held together completely like he wanted it to. But again, the audience hated it. I first heard it and loved it and had played it weekly for the last 40 years, but most people hated it. And Neil didn't care. It's a classic sort of self-absorbed artist. I don't care if you don't like it, then don't buy it, I don't care. Now, I set up these sort of three juxtapositions. Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky, the progression of Davis, and then sort of the happy Neil Young as compared to the remarkably disturbed Neil Young, because it gets us at that sense of what is a genius, what's the role of the artist, what's the responsibility, and oddly, as part of that responsibility, the need to essentially piss on your own audience by saying, I'm glad you bought all my other albums, thank you, but yeah, I'm not ever doing that again because it was stupid. And hence the classic sort of tortured artist. So anyway, that's what I do. It works very well, and I'm more than happy to loan out the PowerPoint if you'd like. Thank you.